Hey everyone, Raelan here. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm very excited to have Dan Neuffer with me. I had the opportunity to interview him, and anyone who follows me on social media knows that I was really excited at the prospect of getting to speak with him because he is just such a wealth of information and such an informative and influential person in our chronic fatigue syndrome or ME CFS community. And when I found out I was going to be talking to him, I put the message out on social media asking people, what should I ask him? Help, send me some questions. And people sent me dozens and dozens of questions. So thank you to everyone who sent those over. And although we couldn't answer all of them, he actually answered a lot and he did not shy away from the tough questions. And I know this is a long interview, but the whole thing is timestamped, so you can jump around and just go to the parts that interest you. And for those of you who aren't aware, Dan Neuffer is a former physicist and someone who himself suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome and POTS and fibromyalgia for 7 years before finally fully recovering. And his recovery resulted from his research and his explanation of what the root cause of this illness is. And he shares his explanation for the root cause and the dynamics of this illness in his book, CFS Unravelled. And it's a book that's not only been helpful for scores of people who are suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome or ME/CFS, but it's attracted a lot of attention from the medical community and the scientific community as well. Hey Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
It's great to connect with you, Raelan.
I know we have a very sort of ambitious plan schedule. We have a lot of questions, put it out there to the people on Instagram and Facebook, just asking, I'm going to be interviewing Dan Neuffer. What should I ask him? I have no idea what to ask. And people sent so many questions my way. And you've been really good about being willing to tackle a lot of them. So
yeah, look, I appreciate you got a bit flooded there with questions, and look, I'll try and be succinct so that we can try and answer as many as possible. I guess some answers will be longer than others, so we'll just see how we go.
So let's dive right in. A big one that comes up, I think a good place to start talking about chronic fatigue syndrome is with the cause. Of course, quite a few people were asking what you felt the cause of CFS was.
Even though the World Health Organization has actually classified ME/CFS as a neurological illness now, going back many years, decades, in fact, I believe. But it's still a popular view that the cause of the illness is unknown, even though we've got a lot of evidence that's accumulated over the decades. Now, I published CFS Unravelled in 2013, and that book was based on my own explanation, my own hypothesis for the pathogenesis of the illness. Although in hindsight, I did then afterwards recognize that many other people had come up with some similar ideas, actually going back decades, even back in the 70s. And basically, what I'm saying, the root cause of the illness, so not the trigger, right? Because people are triggered by many different things, but the root cause that perpetuates the illness is a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, or ANS for short. And the ANS is the part of the nervous system that basically regulates all the bodily systems. And that really makes a lot of sense because many people have the experience that they go to the doctor and they tell them about all these symptoms, gut symptoms, neurological symptoms, fatigue, pain. I mean, so many different things. That's often, sadly, they're not believed. And the reason is it's kind of unlikely that any one person would have so many different things wrong with them. That's just a fact. When we have an illness, you have a set of symptoms. You don't have all these symptoms. And that is really the biggest hint, because the only way, I often say, the only way someone could have this many symptoms is either if they're like a hypochondriac or crazy making it up, or they have autonomic dysfunction. And sadly, it's the first one that's often that people sort of adopt, which is really terribly unfair, because the autonomic nervous system really controls every system in the body. And that's why we have problems in every system in the body.
So even though this presents like there's a lot of things going wrong in the body, it's all coming down to one core thing, actually one issue that's triggering all these different things.
That's right. And again, some people in the past which I found out after I published my book, who talked about nervous system dysfunction. It does become, we have to be a little bit more open-minded. So the nervous system dysfunction and dysregulation causes secondary problems as well. And some of these secondary problems can have a life of their own as well. So it's not solely a nervous system dysfunction, because once the nervous system dysfunction is running for long enough, we get secondary problems. But people often treat those secondary problems, and it's a merry-go-round. We treat this, we treat that, and you never kind of recover because the thing that's causing it hasn't been resolved. So it's my view that the best way is actually to do both.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. And just firing through the questions here, Danielle wanted to ask, she'd like to understand why POTS, posterior osthetic tachycardia, I don't know if I'm saying that right, develops with CFS.
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is.
So, again, in the wider medical community, that we have a whole bunch of different illnesses. So we have chronic fatigue syndrome. Some people will say that ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, is a different illness. But it's maybe a slightly different diagnostic criteria. Then we have POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Again, considered a different illness, usually diagnosed by a cardiologist. Then we have fibromyalgia, often diagnosed by a rheumatologist, although arguably speaking, a rheumatologist really shouldn't be the person diagnosing it. A neurologist would be more appropriate, if you ask me. But that's historical, because they used to think that it was a rheumatic kind of illness. And but actually, all of these illnesses are the same. So I'm not saying that they're not related. I'm not saying that they're similar, related, or one leads to the other. I'm saying that they are the one and single illness, and the only difference is that they're expressed differently.
So it's not that CFS is causing POTS. It's the part
CFS
of the same umbrella. Okay.
Yeah. I believe that because they're all dysautonomia. And with POTS, even the wider medical community recognizes that POTS is dysautonomia. That's what it is. ANS dysfunction. But we see when people experience CFS, it's not so easily measured, the ANS dysfunction, because the way it is expressed in the body is different. It's more subtle. And because you then get these secondary things, it all gets a little bit murky. So we need to kind of step back often and look at the whole picture. That's how I came up with my hypothesis. You look at all the symptoms, right? You look at all the way people get ill. And subsequent to, me developing the hypothesis, I obviously then also looked at all the ways people get well. And actually, when you look at all of that, it's so obvious that it is ANS dysfunction.
Okay, so that leads right into another question that one listener asked about if there's a link between EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, and CFS. And Lauren asked, what are your thoughts on Lyme disease as a cause of CFS?
Yeah, look, this could be a whole podcast. I'm going to keep it brief. Look, there has been a lot of this discussion around these illnesses. And it does get a little complicated. Epstein-Barr virus, often people talk about mono or glandular fever, has been often linked to CFS, because you'll often find people who get Epstein-Barr will end up having chronic fatigue syndrome, and a lot of the symptoms overlap. And so we think, well, that's what it is. That's what causes it. But then you got to look at other people who get chronic fatigue syndrome who don't have Epstein-Barr virus. So it can't be the cause or the underlying mechanism if not all the people have it. I myself, when I first got ill, I thought it was a virus, because we all, the way we get ill, we all tend to think it's something like this. I went to the doctor, he tested me, he kept wanting to give me antibiotics for my red throat or painkillers, and didn't have pain, and I'm like, what's this all about? And sure enough, when he gave me the antibiotics, I did get the rash that you often get with Epstein-Barr virus, but the blood work showed that I didn't have Epstein-Barr virus, but I had it. So I don't think that it is a central thing. And I think the story between Epstein-Barr virus and Lyme disease is very similar. In essence, it is that when a body is not, an immune system is not functioning adequately, an infection can produce problems, can produce symptoms.
So in essence, the underlying cause was already there.
Well, look, you may have come down with Epstein-Barr virus or Lyme disease, or you may have had it before, but and it may even be part of the trigger of you developing ANS dysfunction, right? Because it is a big stressor on this system. But usually you find that they're not in isolation. There's usually multiple triggers that people experience at the same time to start to develop ANS dysfunction. And, look, I mean, the best way to explain it might be with Lyme disease is this. You see, I know somebody who got Lyme disease. They got really, really ill. And they went to the doctor, and the doctor gave them, a bucket full of antibiotics, which he took for I think 6 or 8 weeks. And then a month or two after that, he was back to normal. And yet when you speak to other people who have Lyme, or chronic Lyme as it's then labeled, they find it doesn't work at all. They take antibiotics for years and they're still ill. And in essence, what I'm saying is that they do have Lyme disease and it is causing problems, but they have CFS at the same time. And they kind of, one feeds the other, because if your immune system isn't working properly, it's difficult to get rid of an infection or not to be affected by an infection, right? And of course, if you have a really bad infection that's sort of out of control, then that puts a lot of strain on the body, including the nervous system, which kind of perpetuates. And that's why I talk about a multilateral recovery approach and working with other healthcare professionals like doctors and other specialists. And, interesting, you see some people, I remember one girl I spoke to, she had Lyme, chronic Lyme, and then she recovered from CFS and Lyme. She recovered from her symptoms. Right? She had CFS and she had Lyme. And then she went to get tested, and she was still Lyme positive, but no symptoms. Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. And I too tested positive for Epstein-Barr virus and for Lyme disease. And I did, a couple months worth of antibiotics, and it didn't help me. And my understanding is that a lot of people have been exposed to these things. So why do a lot of people get these things and they get better and some people don't? So thinking about it as the CFS is the underlying sort of issue makes a lot of sense. Yeah. All right. What do we got next here? Okay. So we had another question asking if mental health problems such as anxiety, PTSD, etc., can be the cause and problem. And someone else asked, how far does healing trauma go towards healing ME/CFS?
Yeah, so this again becomes quite controversial when people talk about this, because so many of us go to a doctor and then we're told we have depression or we're just anxious. There's nothing actually wrong with us. And this isn't true. We may be anxious or we may be depressed, or we certainly will become depressed if we keep being told that we're just depressed and there's nothing wrong with us, right? But, we have a real physical illness. However, we will find that a lot of people with CFS and fibromyalgia do actually have a history of trauma or anxiety or depression. And the connection is that, in my view, PTSD is on the same spectrum as CFS and fibromyalgia. It is an autonomic dysfunction. It is a dysfunction in the brain. And, we look at it differently because with PTSD, there is a trauma, like a psychological event, and we develop strong psychological symptoms, but people also develop physical symptoms. But in essence, I'm saying they're actually kind of along the same spectrum. So yeah, a lot of people will have PTSD. In fact, I myself had PTSD, but 18 months before I got ill.
Okay. So it sounds like, again, when we link it to the autonomic nervous system, it's, that stress response. So that makes sense. If we're looking at trauma, we're looking at PTSD, how they would be linked. And if I understand what you're saying, they express themselves.
Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that everyone it doesn't mean it's a psychological illness or that everyone with the illness has anxiety or PTSD, because it's just simply not true, right? But it's like a predisposing factor. And interestingly enough, you will find, because of the overlap, that even people who have no history of anxiety and then they get ill with CFS will often come to develop anxiety. And sometimes they're really kind of taken aback by this, because they're like, well, I'm not an anxious person. Like, I'm not getting this anxiety. And sometimes the anxiety is not even specific, because we think of anxiety as I'm anxious about blah, blah, blah. But sometimes people just have anxiety feelings and they have no reasons for it. And the reason is it's the autonomic dysfunction that's basically producing the physiological response of anxiety in the body.
Okay, so trying to isolate that anxiety and just focus on healing just that probably isn't going to be what most people need.
No, well, it's not, but it's going to help a lot. In fact, people who do have PTSD, in my experience, and that's why we speak about this also in my program, is that they need to engage with the right professionals to resolve that. And that is a big step forward in their recovery. Because whilst you have severe anxiety or you have PTSD, in my experience, it can be challenging to recover from the illness.
All right.
Because constantly being triggered.
Okay, so another question was, I would like to ask why patients who suffer from endometriosis are more likely to contact CFS or fibromyalgia. Is that something that you found in your experience? Yeah,
I have found that, and also found it around the other way, that people with CFS fibromyalgia pods end up developing endometriosis.
Okay.
I mean, we've got to understand with health that we really don't fully understand anything, right? It's very complicated. We have a reasonable understanding these days in medicine, but there's always more to it, to the picture than we truly understand. However, it's my view that the reason for that connection is that endometriosis is strongly linked to a change in the hormonal profile of ladies. Mm-hmm. So this change in their hormones, so I'm not talking about menopause, I'm just saying that they have a different hormonal profile, appears to be connected to endometriosis, right? And the ANS, when the ANS is dysfunctioning, that's exactly what the ANS does. It regulates all the hormones, and that starts to go askew. And that's why it leads to things like endometriosis. But it leads to a whole bunch of things. That's just one of many.
Okay.
Like hypothyroidism and all of that. Those are directly expressions of ANS dysfunction.
Okay. And one last question on this topic was, what is the connection between migraines and CFS? And how do you get rid of both? Because you definitely hear a lot of people suffering from migraines with CFS. Yeah,
absolutely. And especially even more so when they've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia. It's interesting because, again, people look at it and think that it has to do with hormonal expression. And I mean, there's lots of theories about migraines. It's very complicated. I'm not an expert on migraines, but in my experience, lots of people get it, and they often get it triggered at a certain time in their cycle. And many ladies will also find that in a certain part of their monthly cycle that they'll also get flare-ups and symptoms worsening. And this has been a theory with migraines. And so I know there was a piece of research where they've looked at, what are the hormonal profiles of people who then experience the migraines. But what they actually found, that these hormonal changes that they had been theorizing for a long time are not necessarily there. Okay? And so the issue, it would appear, is that it's not necessarily that we have such a out of whack hormone expression, but rather that there is a change in the way that the body responds to the hormones. And so as we cycle through those monthly hormones, rather than them being really bad, it's more that the brain reacts more strongly. In other words, we're really talking about sensitization. Right? We're really talking about a sensitization issue as opposed to a hormonal issue.
Sounds like what you're saying. So you could be tested for your hormone levels and they might be coming up within the normal range, but that doesn't mean that they're not causing issues because of the way
That's exactly right.
Okay. All right. So with the nervous system being central, people are often talking about neuroplasticity. And this is something I don't know. I mean, you've been, elbow deep in this for ages, and I'm only just learning about this in the last couple of years, but it's quite new to me. But now, maybe just because I'm aware of it, it feels like I'm hearing about it and seeing it everywhere, and people are a lot more aware. So naturally, I mean, a focus of your program is about this. So a lot of questions came up about this, about brain training and neuroplasticity. So for those people who are new to this, can you explain, briefly what brain training and neuroplasticity are?
Okay, so neuroplasticity is basically the ability for the brain to change how it functions. And that can occur in two ways. It can either occur through like a physical change, like through growth, and this is or known as neurogenesis or structural neuroplasticity, or it can be a functional change, and that's where the neurons in the brain learn to behave differently and connect differently, and that's often referred to as cortical remapping. Now, brain training or neural retraining, or however you like to call it, is the application of exercises and training to affect neuroplasticity. Now, in the CFS community, when people talk about this, and there's lots of programs out there, they tend to focus on psychological mechanisms to try and affect this neuroplasticity. But actually, the opportunities for neuroplasticity are both with physical movement as well as psychological mechanisms, because the brain controls everything, right? And it senses everything. So it is affected by your thoughts. It's affected by your legs. If you bang yourself with a hammer, you feel it, right? Your brain's connected to everything. It's central. And neuroplasticity was something that doctors basically strongly felt is something that happens a lot in childhood, which explains how people learn a lot in childhood and why people can learn languages very easily when they're young. But basically, by the time they were an adult, it was suggested that there was no neuroplasticity. And I think at this stage, I should probably mention one of the fathers of neuroplasticity, which was Professor Michael Merzenich. He was really a scientist that championed this, and he had so much difficulty trying to bring the medical community on board because everyone was so set in their mind that you can't have neuroplasticity as an adult. So he even had to, skew the language in his medical papers not to use that term, even though he had clear evidence that this was happening. Eventually, people came around because there was just overwhelming evidence, and in fact, cochlear implants were one of the things that developed out of this. So those are, where people can't hear, and they make a connection into the brain, a different part of the brain, and that part of the brain then learns to interpret those signals that are coming in from that device and converts them to hearing. So hopefully that gives you a summary.
It does, yeah. And it helps me understand it a lot better than, virtually everything that I've read. And I've been thinking about it a lot. I suspect a lot of us do in terms of, fixing the mind with the mind. So neuroplasticity or brain training is all just, we do it with thoughts. But of course, our whole body is going to connect how our brain functions.
Well, and, it's a little bit perplexing that there's still, I mean, obviously, you got to understand, like even 10 or 20 years ago, I mean, all the doctors were trained 30 and 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? And so all that's what they were taught. And they hear this, and it's difficult to make a change. It takes time, But in a way, it seems a little perplexing that there would be resistance to this idea, because if you have a car accident and afterwards, you get some damage and you can't walk, or you have a stroke, that's probably the better example. You have a stroke victim, they can't speak. They can't move their face properly afterwards. They can't walk. Then they go and they learn to speak and walk. Well, the part of the brain that was doing that is dead. So the only way that can happen is for another part of the brain to start taking over those functions, and that's neuroplasticity.
One of the questions, and I think you might have just answered it actually, but even though it's awareness is spreading, any thoughts on why it's not more mainstream? Is that because you think many doctors and many professionals were trained decades ago and they just weren't trained on this?
Well, many doctors are still not trained on these things. I mean, medicine has a fairly narrow approach, let's say, I would say, and it's very firm, and doctors are not to step outside of that. Okay, so modern medicine is all about consensus, and whether it's research supported or not is not really what it's about. It's about whether everyone agrees what's the right thing. Okay, that's not all bad, because you might have one piece of research. That doesn't mean it's a fact. Just because you got one piece of research, and there's many areas of medicine. I don't want to go into them in detail because it all gets very controversial, but where the mainstream way of treating things with certain illnesses, with certain medications, it isn't really supported by the research, and I think the reason is because it takes time for the information to trickle through the system. And think about it, if you're a doctor, you need to be trained. How long does training take? Maybe 6 years, right? And then afterwards, you want to become a specialist. Before you know it, you've invested like 10, 15 years into actually becoming the expert, right? And then you might also have to, if you then become a professor and you're teaching people, then that takes time for that curriculum to develop. And for all of this to filter through, it takes a long time. It takes a long time. But there are doctors, many wonderful doctors all over the world. My program is being used in 60 countries now around the world. And there's doctors all over the world who appreciate the power of neuroplasticity. And many doctors intuitively already know what is the cause of the illness, even if it's not formally described that way. It's just sometimes the language that they use to explain to their patients isn't perhaps the best to make it receptive to the patients, so I think, doctors are all trying to do their best, and it's just one of these things. It's a big system, and information takes time to trickle through.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so you developed an education program, to help recover from these conditions. So naturally, a lot of questions came up around the ANS Rewire program. So, one of the questions that came up a couple of times is, what conditions is ANS Rewire best for?
It's really for ME, CFS, fibromyalgia, POTS, multiple chemical sensitivities, electromagnetic hypersensitivity. I'd say those are the core conditions. And sometimes some people don't get these diagnoses. They might be diagnosed with adrenal fatigue or something along those lines. That's also included, yeah.
Okay. And we have a few questions that sort of bundle together around this. So Ali asked, would be really interested in hearing your views on how somebody can give your program or brain retraining programs in general the best chance, or why doesn't it help everybody?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the best chance is really by being fully committed to a process, as opposed to looking for that magic silver bullet cure, right? So it's about saying, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to persist with it, and I'm going to add strategies as required until I get a result. So that is really I think the most important thing in order to have success. And in order for people to do that, they tend to have to be fully convinced by the explanation in the first place.
Yeah.
If they're still thinking, but I've got this infection, or I've got this syndrome, or it's the Lyme, or it's all these other things, then they end up putting all the energy into those rabbit holes as opposed to addressing things and focusing on the ANS dysfunction. That's why I don't encourage people to get into the programs too quickly. Yeah, I get them to sit there for hours first watching lessons for free and say, do you really think this is right for you?
It reminds me of a couple of things that I read over and over. There's one expression, and I don't know who to attribute to, but whether you believe something will work or you believe that it won't, you're right. Like, so your belief plays a big role into it. And then another thing, is around just, sometimes the biggest barrier to recovery, I think, is just getting past our own selves, believing that these things work and understanding that how they help.
Look, and I think this is a really important thing. I mean, some people talk about belief like, oh, so I have to believe in order for it to work. And that's not true. I mean, this is not logical or something. Well, there is some science behind that. But the real biggest issue is, let's say we take even a medication, a heart medication, that we know 100% creates a certain effect in the body. Well, guess what? If you don't believe in it, it won't work. And people go, what? Of course it works. Double-blind placebo, blah, blah, blah. No, it won't work, because in order for it to work, every day you've got to take it out of the bottle, put it in your mouth, swallow it with a bit of water. And if you don't believe it'll work, people don't do that.
Yeah. The studies on this kind of stuff are just fascinating. Or, they give people stimulants and tell people that they're sedatives, and just that belief is so strong that stimulant puts them to sleep. And it's
absolutely. And that's the other side of it. The belief does have a big impact. The placebo has a huge impact. In fact, it's the bane of scientific research. It's so frustrating, because you're trying to do some research here. You're trying to say, does this medication work? And you test it and you go, yes, it works. Fantastic. So then you do the placebo, and the placebo works too. So now it's like, oh, it has to be better than the placebo, right? Yeah. And, it's a good medication, it does the job, but the placebo often also can have a significant impact. Now, with some people, it can have a bigger impact than others. And if we've placed more research on how that works, we could probably mobilize the body more effectively towards solving many diseases.
Right. So with the ANS Rewire program, it's not that you're saying, oh, you just have to believe in it. Like, believe in this magic fairy dust and it will make you better. It's just that the belief, it does impact how successful things are, no matter what it is.
It has an impact. And look, I want to answer that second part of Ali's questions, which I think was that why does it not work for some people? Is that what she said?
Yeah, or Alan followed up with a similar question. You'd like to know the estimated success rate, and why are there some groups that respond better than others? Some groups that it just probably won't work well for.
Yeah. So why? Let's have a look at why. In medicine, again, people look at it and love to say, oh, there's this responder group and a non-responder group, and there's subgroups in CFS, and everyone talks about this. And of course, there are differences in people, difference in triggers. Some people have PTSD, some people don't. Some people have gut parasites, some people don't. It's huge heterogeneous community. However, I don't believe that is the reason why someone responds or not. Because certainly, when I look at, it's like a bell curve you see in response. Okay, so you get on one end, I might have these miracle cure people, and it's astounding. People who are bedbound, people who are ill for years, couch-bound, decades, and then 90 days later they're like, hiking in the mountains and they're in their 70s, and you kind of go, sounds too good to be true. It probably is. You know what I mean? Sounds very suspect, And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have people who get no response. And then you have the majority of the people who make progress. Like I'm talking like at 4 or 5 month mark. You know what I mean? And then you have the majority of people who have made progress and varying the level of progress. And so then you say, okay, well, what's going on? And it gets so complicated, right? With all these different factors that are going on, and are they doing all the things they need to? Are they doing them effectively? Are they able to do them? Do they need other help? Assistance or treatments or whatever. But when I look at the end parts of it, it gets much clearer why somebody has an amazing result and why somebody has no result. And that it tends to be really with how they're engaging, how they're able to engage, and if there are any triggering mechanisms that need additional treatment. Yeah.
What about age? This question comes up so much for me. And, when I do interviews, they're like, please, can you interview some more older people? And so many people asked when they knew that I was going to be speaking with you to ask you about age. Does that impact recovery? Is it going to be harder or impossible, the older you are?
Look, I don't think anyone should be told it's impossible to recover for them, because
Amen.
there is no scientific definitive evidence to say you can't do it. And early on, when I come up with this hypothesis, and I didn't have experience with people, it was just a theory. In fact, when I came up with the theory, I was convinced I was right, but I didn't really think that I was going to recover because I never heard of anyone recovering. I didn't know it existed. That's why I started the recovery interviews, right? Mm-hmm. But I would have said, yeah, look, if you're older, I think you'll struggle because less neuroplasticity. I would have said to you, if you've been ill a really long time, those neural pathways are much more ingrained. Mm. If you have certain comorbidities, certain other illnesses or complications, goodness, it gets to a point where you go, it's not possible for you to recover. And I would have been wrong in all of those things because my experience, theoretically, you can give an answer why this should be the case or might be the case, You can have that opinion, but the evidence doesn't support that. And I've seen people in their 70s recover. I have seen people recover after 3 and 4 decades. I've seen people recover, or severity was another one. I thought if you're really, really severely ill, mm-hmm. that you might not be able to recover. And then I was very severely ill when this turnaround started for me. I was bedbound. I couldn't speak, But again, it hasn't been my experience. And the other thing is, I would have I still held on to the belief that if one of those things is going on, that it'll probably take you longer. It might be true to some extent, but it is not written in stone. Because I have seen people where you thought that's going to be a hard journey, that's going to take forever, recover quickly. And I've seen other people where you thought, oh, this should be quick and easy, and it can take them quite a long time.
All right. Yeah. So age should not feel like a limiting factor.
No. And look, I've truly seen people recover who shouldn't. I've seen people recover where I've gone, this person really has Buckley's. They've got no chance. They've got things going on that are so severe that theoretically, it is just, how can they recover? How can they do brain training? Because they have mental disturbances. And things like schizophrenia and things like that. And they, still recovered. Yeah.
All right. One question someone wanted to ask, I'm really curious to hear your answer on this one. So they said, I've always wondered if your program is also useful for people who fulfill the criteria for ME and not just CFS, plus autoimmune disorders that developed over time, such as MCAS and POTS.
So, ME, CFS, POTS, I'm saying it's one illness.
Right.
It's not a different illness in my view, it's a different diagnostic criteria. So because the people with this illness are heterogeneous, they're all different. Mm-hmm. Some people might fit in, but then in many countries, ME and CFS is not a different diagnostic criteria. For many people, it's just a different word. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people get hung up on this, and they say, "Oh, this person has CFS. Oh, but I've got ME." Well, if they went to your doctor, they would have ME as well. Yeah. So that's not so much of an issue. Now, with regards to mast cell activation syndrome, there are a whole range of dysfunctions and autoimmune conditions and thyroid, lots of things that develop that tend to resolve as people recover. Hypothyroidism is one of them. Some people then develop Hashimoto's, right, where they have this autoimmune issue and it can create a problem with the thyroid. I don't know that they recover from that kind of hypothyroidism, but what they then find, the ones that I've spoken to that have recovered, they just take the medication, they're symptom-free, they've got no issues anymore, right? So before, the hypothyroidism was this big problem, really because they had CFS or fibro or POTS, and now that they don't have that, they don't have any problems, they just take their medicine. I don't have enough experience with mast cell activation syndrome specifically to say that somebody recovered from that or someone's been tested, because not everyone gets tested for this. Like, many people have many things and they just don't get accurately tested before and after. So I can't really say on that one specifically.
Okay. So Kim asked, how do you recommend we proceed with ANS Rewire if we are bedridden, severe, and only have a few minutes a day, on good days only, in which we might be able to listen to his videos, and can't watch due to visual sensitivity?
If you can't watch due to visual sensitivity, don't watch, just listen. So it's important. We've got to move forward however we can. Let's forget the rules and Dan says this and this person says that, and you got to find your way to move forward regardless, because you have to, all right? You need to get out of this suffering. If you can't watch, listen. If you can't listen, I wouldn't enroll in a program. Okay? Because if you can't sit down and listen for like 20, 30 minutes or at least 15 minutes, so that you can, because you can do the program at your own pace. But if you can't at least listen for 15 minutes, then you're probably not going to be able to get the benefit of the program. Right. What instead you want to do is you want to, get your education however you can. If you can't through videos, maybe through read the book, CFS Unravelled, build some basic strategies up, just creating a healing environment, meditation. Just build yourself up a little bit, however you can, to be able to get to that. I can't give them specific sort of ideas of what to do, because obviously if they're saying they can't engage in things, then they wouldn't hear your answer. They wouldn't be hearing my answer right now.
Right. Right. Well, that makes sense. Another question was, how could someone give themselves the best chance of having this work? And is there a certain point in your health journey when this is most effective?
I think it's similar to what I said earlier. It's really just about, you've got to come to this place where you go, okay, this makes sense. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it until I get fully well. And I'm going to do whatever else I need. I think that's really the key.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I do hear some people talking about, there's a series or an order that we're supposed to do things to heal our body. And that wasn't my experience. I sort of did everything all at once. But other people, there's different theories, like you said, a zillion theories out there floating around. So I think people are naturally confused and like, okay, if I'm just at the beginning, is it the wrong time? Should I wait a little bit? Or it sounds like it doesn't really matter.
I think one thing, basically, as I said, you have to be convinced. And what happens is, early on, people often get caught up in other things. Like, oh, it's something else. I caught a virus. I caught this. And until they resolve that and have treated it and it didn't work, and they go, okay, that's not going to be my path, they can't move forward. And whilst people are still caught up in whatever that is, it could be anything, they struggle to engage in something like ANS Rewire. ANS Rewire is actually encouraging you to do multiple things, all the things at the same time, right? Because we want to take that pressure off the nervous system. It's interesting. One of the things I've noticed, and maybe because you started doing recovery interviews also, so you perhaps noticed this as well, but one of the things I noticed is that people often start their recovery. You'd think that if you're feeling better, you'd be better off to start your recovery. But actually, people often start their recovery after they hit rock bottom, right? And why? Because they get to this point, not that we don't try. We all want to get well, but there's a shift in the approach. When they hit rock bottom, you kind of say, I will do whatever it takes. I will do it. Whatever it is, I will do it, right? And it is that sort of determination and ability to be flexible that really has a big impact. I think it's the flexibility, because there's certain things we don't want to do. Yeah. No, that's... Then you get desperate and you go, okay, I will not eat chocolate anymore or drink alcohol. Yeah. Or, whatever. This is so bad that I will just do whatever you say. Whoever they're talking to, The pain of where you are has to be greater than the pain of making those changes. Like all of a sudden I'm so uncomfortable that I have to make changes. And I actually, you just explained it so well. And I talk about this in my book as well, because I think, at least I know I can only speak to my experience, but there's
great temptation. You know, I recovered to a point where I got to probably 60-70% better. So I could live, I could do stuff, I could travel. And so then I just coasted like that for years. Like
That's right.
it was suffering and it was no way to live, but I didn't have that fire lit. And plus, sometimes it feels like you can only put your life on hold for so long. So if you start to see some recovery, then it's like, oh, I should go back to work. I should start taking my kids to soccer again. And your attention shifts. And then
Absolutely.
you don't make it the rest of the way. So, yeah.
I see this all the time. You know, I started to speak to someone, they're ecstatic, they were bedbound, they had a 70% recovered, you know? Yeah. And they're like, oh, yeah, but, you know, I'm finding it hard to do all the things in the program now, and I can't seem to get any better. Okay, are you doing this? Well, are you doing this? Are you doing that? You go, why not? Oh, well, I've got to take the kids to school, and I've got to make lunches and prepare dinner. And they go, no, you don't. You go, well, I'm a parent, I'm a mother, I have to. Were you doing that when you were in bedbound? Yeah. Did the children starve? What happened? Do you have more children, and these are the fat ones that survived from like a food? How did this happen, right? So we change our rules. We go, oh, I have responsibilities. I have to do this. I have to do that. And we then deprioritize. And this is reasonable. I'm not saying this is not reasonable. I mean, I'm sure, you know, we're all like that, right? Mm-hmm. But what we need to do is we need to say, you wouldn't do that if you had cancer.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got to take my kids to school and I have to make lunch, so I'll do some chemotherapy next week. Yeah. Right? If the doctor said, if you don't have this, you're going to be dead, then you know what I mean? It's like people would do it.
Yeah.
And I think with CFS, because it's a scale, we get caught out. And I see this often. Get to 70-80% and we disengage.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well said. A lot of questions came up around ANS Rewire and how it varies from different programs out there. Could you explain that a little bit for us?
So look, I mean, ideally, we would have people who've done all the programs really share their experiences, I think. Because different programs out there are different, and people will find different programs resonate more with them than others. I can't say because I haven't done all these different programs, but right. I can only reflect perhaps what people have told me who've done other programs. And I think the biggest difference is that most of these other programs tend to focus on brain training, and ANS Rewire focuses on a multilateral approach. It's an education program that talks about diet, physical movement, all of these things, right? You've probably found that when you've listened, if you've done recovery English with people who did brain training, mm-hmm. that actually when you speak to them, they did a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
And that other stuff doesn't often get featured the way it needs to,
mm-hmm.
but the other stuff is often essential. And that's and we've got to look at the nervous system. The nervous system is impacted by everything. So it's okay to train your brain, but if you are stimulating your nervous system inappropriately, you're going to have problems. And everybody with CFS and fibro knows that, or multiple chemical sensitivities, right? Okay, so just go and have a run. Go on a marathon and do your brain training. See what happens, right? It's not going to end well, right? And these things, the brain training shouldn't be in isolation, because diet, movement, all these other physical factors actually, you know, like if you had a stroke and you can't walk, you don't just go there and go, okay, brain training. Okay, leg, move. Leg, move. That's what you are doing, right? You need to do that. Leg, move. Move. You try and move it. It's not moving. But the physiotherapist will take your foot and they'll move it.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say, okay, make your leg move. Move leg, and then they move the leg. Right?
Yeah.
So we're doing both. We're doing both parts, right? And ANS Rewire also focuses on retraining the brain, not just to physical strategies or working with doctors or physiotherapists or whatever you need, or a trauma specialist if you have PTSD, as an example, right? But also we use physical strategies to rewire the brain. So the brain does not just respond to our thoughts or input through our auditory and visual centers, right? It also responds through our physiology. And by that, I don't just mean the physical things that are going on, although these are critical, like your blood sugar levels, what's going on with your gut, all of these things in your body, right? Because the ANS is supposed to sense and regulate those, but also the way our body moves. Okay. So Professor Ledoux of New York State University has done, he's one of the global experts on how this works, and he's done a lot of research, and he has discovered that the physical positions of our body influence our brain's threat assessment. So even if you're thinking there's not a problem, there's no threat, everything's fine, I'm hunky-dory, I'm happy thoughts, but your body is going like this in a certain way, your brain will go, hang on, something's going on. So yeah, that's why we've got to take a more, a wider approach to training the brain, in my view.
Thank you for explaining all that. And I think it demystifies it a bit, or maybe I suspect some of the skepticism, I don't know what you think, but that people have around brain training programs for the people that are still skeptical is that it sounds a little bit too like, oh, I just lay around and I think some thoughts and then I'm better. But what I'm hearing you saying, it's so much more than that. It's tied into to movement, to everything that you're doing in your life. It's
absolutely,
it's all intertwined.
Because if that was true, then you just have to do positive thinking and you'd be cured. And that hasn't really been the vast majority of people's experience. Yeah.
So you actually have two websites. You have the ansrewire.com website with the program, and then you also have the CFS Unravelled.com website that has educational articles, videos, information about the book, and also, your recovery interviews that you're so well known for. But I found it really interesting that you share how people recover in all sorts of ways, even some really unexpected ways. And by using, programs that are not yours, which is not something that people typically do, is promote, their, competitors or whatever we want to call it. So I'm curious your motivation behind that.
Well, you got to understand that this whole thing was, first of all, born. I mean, I wrote the book. I mean, I don't know that anyone makes money out of books, right? I didn't do this for money. Right. I wrote the book because I had this hypothesis and I was convinced by it, right? And I wanted to share it. And I actually gave it away for free. I gave away 5,000 copies, right? Wow. But the issue is you give someone something for free, they don't actually use it. So anyway, we got it published properly, and then so it was advocacy work. That's how CFS Unravelled started. I did 5-6 years of advocacy work. It was just trying to spread the word that, hey, recovery is possible, and this is how people do it. And so I started sharing all these different stories of different people in different ways. Then, because I kept having calls of help and I was helping people, there's only so much work you can do. I mean, I was having my day job, and every night I'm helping people all over the world, not getting paid for it at all at the time either. So it wasn't sustainable. People kept saying, oh, we need more help. And I could see there was a huge education gap. So coaching without an education foundation is a waste of time. I just don't do it, right? And that's why I created the ANS Rewire program, which is how the second website was born. After that, I continued to still publish competitors. I mean, obviously from a business point of view, this doesn't make sense, or sustainability, to do recovery interviews with the people who are using a different program. You're shunting them in the other direction, right? But the reason why I do it is I want people to be aware of the different programs, because the key to success is finding a program and a mentor that you really resonate in. Because remember what you asked me earlier about why do some people do better than others? It's about engagement. And if somebody doesn't like me, or like how I explain things, or doesn't like my sort of scientific focus, and some people get put off by all those details about physiology, and they prefer maybe a more spiritual approach, or maybe a different approach, or a different way somebody talks, they will probably do better with them. They will probably do better with them, right? And that's basically why I not promote. Look, I'm not promoting. I'm just sharing people's experience. And if that works for someone, we should all know about it, shouldn't we?
No, I really respect that. And I suspect a lot of people do, because you know, if your genuine motivation is to help people, and if you are not trying to shelter people from everything else that's out there, I mean, people can see that and they'll respect that. And yeah, no, I think that's a really great approach. Someone else also wanted to ask, is this a limbic system injury, and can retraining the brain help reset the brain and dissolve post-exertion malaise?
So look, two things, well, multiple things there. I don't like the word injury. Like, you know, we can use language, it can have a big impact on how we feel. And saying limbic brain injury, I mean, let's call it a dysfunction rather than an injury. Okay? Because the injury is something that people tend to measure. You know, if I could put you in an MRI and I see, yep, there's that wooden spike, we got to do something about that. That's an injury. Okay? Let's call it dysfunction. And there are some things, some changes, I think, that do occur in the brain. But, you know, it appears we can reverse these things. So that's really the first part of, I guess, that. Yeah, the limbic brain is certainly involved. The limbic brain is directly connected to the autonomic nervous system. So the regulation of the autonomic nervous system is, the limbic brain is involved. But there are also other dampening facts like the prefrontal cortex, which dampens areas that control the autonomic nervous system, like the amygdala. So it's complicated. There's many parts of the brain that are involved. And so, what was the last part of that question?
If it could
resolve post-exertional malaise.
Yes,
that's right. I remember now. So look, post-exertional malaise is a symptom of the illness. Like, people always ask, oh, what about this, or what about this? Will it fix this? No. In fact, people sometimes get shocked when we've got all these symptoms, right? And they say, will this program fix this symptom? I'm like, no, it won't. It won't fix any symptoms, right? You can't fix. In fact, even treatments that should fix symptoms don't fix symptoms for most people, or they fix them for a time and they come back, right? The idea is that we retrain the brain, that we recover from the syndrome, the illness, and as we recover from the syndrome that causes all the symptoms go away. And that sounds like I'm being pedantic, but actually I think it is a critical distinction.
Yeah, that's definitely been my experience as well. And when people ask me, you know, how did you get over this symptom or that symptom? And I don't have an answer for any of it because there wasn't anything specific I did for any symptoms. It was just a sort of general, you know, pulling myself out of this. All right.
It peters away.
Yeah. Yep. So that sort of leads us to some general questions about recovery from this illness. So several people asked about diet, of course, and what role diet plays when it comes to recovery. So what are your thoughts on that, or what's been your experience?
So it's very interesting with diet. There's so many experts in the world, and everyone tells you do this and do that. And I think this is a little narrow-minded. Diet has a lot to do with an individual's experience. And it also has to do with the dysfunctions of an individual. Now, we talk about diet in a program to quite some depth. And many people will say that was one of the first things that made a huge difference to how they were feeling. They're often quite shocked. I mean, I would have been shocked because I'm like, diet, you know, my fatigue and diet. I would have been annoyed because, you know, there's all these people who just eat pizza and beer and they don't have fatigue. Why do I need to eat lettuce all day long, right? And I'm not saying you do, by the way. But so diet is critical. One of the key things that we focus on in the ANS Rewire program is adjusting your diet based on whatever you have to eat now, which you might have been advised by your doctor, functional medicine doctor or naturopath or whoever. Whatever you're doing, we ask you to make certain adjustments. And these adjustments are designed to stop the stimulation of the autonomic nervous system. And because, and again, people think it has, you know, it's the reactivity of the nervous system that's the issue. So we're just trying to dampen that stimulation. That's the first thing we do. The second thing is people will often say, oh, you should go on a keto diet or paleo diet, or then they'll say you should eat a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet, or they say you should eat just raw foods, or some people say you should eat just cooked foods. It actually depends on what's going on with the person. For instance, you can make a big case, many people do, that raw foods are best and all the nutrients, and you should all just eat raw. And it's the worst thing you can do for many people. Mm-hmm. The worst thing, right? They should eat food that hardly even resembles food anymore, right? With maybe a third of the nutrition, and they will do better. So, because it isn't just about nutrition. It has to do with the ability of the body to accept that nutrition, to convert that nutrition into something useful. It has to do with the pressures it places on their body. And to be honest, people are often better getting that advice from their doctor and their naturopath than they are from me. But even if they are getting that advice, we do give some really important distinctions for that nervous system side of things.
Okay. So you help people work with diet, but it's not advocating any specific one.
Yeah. We bring principles in, right? And we talk about certain things that they may need to do, right? And I say may need to. So for some people, we talk about why you might want to cut out gluten, why you might want to cut out grains, why you might want to cut out dairy. But we don't say you have to do that, because frankly, you don't. There's many people who don't do any of those things and they recover. And the issue is, the biggest problem with all these diet things is that it's so stressful. I mean, what have you got with CFS? Like, do you have a great social life? Do you go, your athletics is really where you get all your joy from? I mean, what have you got? Right? And now you're not allowed to eat a cookie, right? Or any kind of treat or anything. You're just supposed to sit there and eat food that you don't enjoy, perhaps.
Yeah.
Terrible idea. So 1, make changes. 2, seek to make them enjoyable. And 3, remember the most important thing is your morale. Because if you don't do this over the long term, to get fully well, I mean, 3 weeks of eating something that you hate gives you a lot of stress. It's not going to change your chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah.
You've got to be practical.
Yeah. Good point. One person wanted to ask, what about spontaneous recovery? Are people with chronic pain or CFS ever miraculously healed? I'm very curious to hear your answer on this as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, first of all, I will say you will find reports of spontaneous recovery.
Okay.
But in my experience, there's no such thing. If you actually interview these people in detail, you'll see there's nothing spontaneous about it, right? So, in fact, I have many interviews I haven't published as yet, right? Because I'm finding it difficult to get it done. I need some help, right? But some of them I've struggled to publish. There's one that comes to mind with a lady who was healed by faith. Now, I'm not judging her experience, right? Because she was definitely ill, right? There's no doubt about it. She had CFS, and she was definitely well afterwards. And she had this experience with her faith. And, you mentioned earlier about the research about belief and how it can have a huge impact. So, I mean, one issue is obviously how would people react? People would be non-religious people or, would be all aghast, at the idea of this. What? You're saying it's all in my head. But actually, even when I looked at her story, the faith was this trigger moment. Let's say where she was miraculously healed. But when you actually listen to it, it was miraculously changed her direction, not healed overnight.
Okay.
And when you actually listen carefully, you actually see she did this, she did this, she did this, she did that. And ultimately, no matter what recovery story you will ever hear, it will fit into the framework that I give you in CFS Unravelled. Right? It is basically that multilateral approach that impacts the nervous system, however you do it. And often people don't recognize they're doing these things. And the problem is with some of these spontaneous recoveries, or even recoveries from certain treatments, right? That's one that happens quite often, where I see people, they take a treatment, sometimes a dubious treatment, sometimes a good treatment that makes sense, why it would help them. And then go, oh, this is working, and they're doing all these things, and they're like, great, and they recover, and they attribute their recovery to that treatment. But then they get ill again, and they have to try the treatment, and it doesn't work. And they're like really lost. When you actually look at what they did, is they actually did a number of things, many of them unconsciously, during that recovery process. And by not understanding how the illness works, and the science behind it, they never connect with it, and so they are not able to recreate it. So it's my view that the key for robust recovery is understanding what's going on, understanding how you recovered, understanding why you got ill in the first place. And that's how you build a really robust and lasting recovery.
All right. So there's typically always something happening in that recovery situation, and probably not what you would advocate for people to sort of sit around just waiting for it to go away.
No, look, I think many people will find that they will get these periods where it goes away, sometimes even 70, 80% on its own. They don't always realize how and why that happened, but there are reasons for it. I hear this because people in my program always go, oh yeah, I've recovered 70, 80%. Now I understand why, why that happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But just waiting for it, it's not a great strategy.
All right. Valentina asks, when can someone consider themselves fully recovered? And Lucy asked, can we ever heal our nervous system to its pre-CFS state, or will we always have a nervous system that is more sensitive than average?
Excellent questions. So fully recovered. In fact, I just had this discussion with someone who we were looking at a recovery in the story. I know you actually share partial recovery stories, which I have focused more on people full or virtually full recoveries, probably because there's so much skepticism out there. You see a partial recovery story, oh yeah, well, they're not really gone well and they're going to get worse again and all this kind of thing. But actually, many of those partial recovery stories have really fantastic learnings in them, and people have asked me to share more partial ones. And I come across these partial ones that are just fantastic. And I haven't published them. And she asked me, this girl just yesterday, well, how do you know that you're fully well? And I would say it's not so much by your symptoms, right? Because everybody has symptoms. Even people who are well have some symptoms, right? Well, not everybody, but many people have some symptoms. Or you say, how much energy do I have? Because people often tell me they're fully well, they're recovered, they're symptom free. Yeah. But when I speak to them 6 months later, they're suddenly 125% recovered because they got more vitality, and that can go for up to a year. There you go. Your experience too. Yeah. So there's a difference between symptom free and full vitality. So when I talk about recovered, I would say let's focus on being no longer ill, not having that illness mechanism going. That doesn't mean you can't improve your health, right? Like a doctor will say, you're cured of cancer. And that person might have no hair, barely able to get out of bed, feels ill and nauseous all day long, and they're cured. Yeah. They don't have cancer, right? But they're not healthy, right? Yeah. They'll take a little while. So I think it's when you don't get triggered anymore. If you don't get flare-ups, and the vast majority, 90-95% of your symptoms are gone, and you don't flare them up, I think that's when you're fully recovered. All right. And so was there a second part of the question? Was there something I missed?
Or just, will we always have a nervous system that is more sensitive than average?
I can't say. I can't say for sure, and I think it might vary between people. But on the flip side, once you understand how you recovered and how you got ill, I would, and this is not something I would have said, I probably would have said yes, many, many years ago. I said, yes, you're more vulnerable because you got those neural pathways. Therefore, you're more likely to be able to recreate them. You already know how it's done. Yeah, it's like you learned how to do something, right? But also, when you learn how to recover, you also learn how not to do something. So I've actually been quite ill, unfortunately, over the last 3 years. I had appendicitis. Was very severe. I've had many complications from that in my abdominal muscles, and now I've got some reflux and all of that. And frankly, and a couple of other non-related health issues that came, a bit of bad luck. None of it is fibro-CFS related, which is pretty rare because, when you look at the amount of symptoms you have in CFS and fibro, it covers most things, right? And you would have thought, okay, I would go so far as to say that I reckon a large proportion of people who would have gone through what I've gone through in the last 3 years would have developed CFS or fibro. But I haven't. So perhaps sometimes we can be more robust than other people having had this illness, but it's not necessarily everyone's experience.
All right. So Gemma asked, how quickly can I get better from CFS from being sofa bound? That's, definitely a question that comes up a lot around how long is this going to take?
Yeah, look, you hear some circles in internet communities talking about these super fast stories where people go somewhere and do something and then 3, 4, 5 days later they're miraculously cured. My research does not indicate that is really true.
Okay.
They may feel that way. They certainly have a different outlook, and maybe they have had big shifts. And I do see miraculous kind of shifts. People experiencing it within days, like really stuff that just go, wow, that's not possible. Absolutely. But to be fully recovered, I don't think that can happen that quick, because I'll give you a basic example. One of the things that happens, we have all kinds of minerals that are dysregulated through the autonomic nervous system in our body, and the dysfunctions we experience, you literally can't just overnight replenish them. In fact, you can swallow them all you like. There are mechanisms involved in bringing them into the cells that require energy, right? And you need those, like magnesium, you need it to create energy. This simply can't happen overnight, So I think, but people can recover quickly. And I'm talking, even in a couple of months. Couple of months. I've seen people make full recoveries who were very, very ill, who were couch-bound. But I don't think it should be our aim. And I think a more realistic thing is probably more like 12 months, 18 months, 6 months. And I don't think it's good to put a figure on it, because if you say, it's going to be 12 months,
right,
well, your chances of recovering in 3 are probably low, right? But if you say 3, and then you get to 4 or 5 and you've only made a little bit of progress, you might be disheartened and think something isn't going to work for you. So I think it's best to just put it out of your mind.
Oh, that makes sense.
See, focus on progress rather than the end result.
Yeah. Our expectations have a huge impact on what's going to happen. So you don't want to set up those limiting ideas about how this is going to go.
Yeah, look, I always say to people, aim to be recovered in 3 months. Great, aim for that if you want to, but not so that you'd be crushed or disappointed if it hasn't happened. Yeah. That's the good way to approach it.
So Ali asked, what do you think is one key difference between somebody who puts a lot of effort into recovering and doesn't recover, and somebody who puts in the effort and does recover?
Okay, so this raises that's a great question. Ali asks some great questions.
She does, doesn't she?
So the thing is, there are some brain training approaches that say this is what you have to do, and this will 100% get you well on its own with nothing else. And if you don't recover, then you haven't done it right. And the problem with that is it really leads to a place where people can feel very down. They can feel worse off mentally and physically afterwards than before, right? Because now not only have they not recovered, they're like, it's all my fault because I didn't do it right. Now, it can be a case that sometimes people don't do it right. It can be a case that people don't give it enough effort. But we need to come at that from a place of self-compassion, because it's not so easy to do everything as much as you should. I mean, that isn't easy for people when they're well.
Yeah.
How are you going to do that when you're not well? I mean, the world is filled with people who have phone addictions and obesity problems, and it's not so easy to do what we have to do, and it's also the ability to engage. So I think the difference, and it isn't just about those things. I can tell you there are people who are absolutely dedicated to doing the work. So it's not that they're not doing enough, which often is the case, to be frank. Often people don't give it enough effort, right? But there are people who give it all the effort, and there are people that just can't seem to be able to do the things that they need to do, right? Because there's a skill involved. And there are reasons why we may struggle. Certain people will struggle with doing certain things. But even if they are able to do those things, they may still not recover because there may be more going on. There might be something else going on, right? And that's why I talk about that in CFS Unravelled, try and give this bigger overview, because we've got to look at what is going on in your nervous system, in your body, and in your mind. And, you know, it's like saying, hey, well, you know, the house is all clean and tidy, it all looks good. I mean, we vacuumed, you know, we tidied everything up, we sorted things, we had the walls painted. I mean, our house should look beautiful. Mm-hmm. Yes, but every day you've got the dog playing in the mud in the back. Then it comes in, it rummages through the house, it chews everything up, it sprays all the dirt everywhere. That's why your house looks a mess. So it doesn't matter that you vacuum, do all these things, once the dog's running around. Yeah. And I think that's the difference there with people with CFS. And the key is understanding, where's this dog? What is this dog? Right? Because that can be different things for different people.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's really tough to compare. I mean, how do you measure that people have put in the same effort? No two people really seem to have the exact same thing going on. So it's really tough to say, like, I did exactly what they did. Why don't I have the same results? Because it's never going to look exactly the same, it sounds like.
Yes, that's right. And that's the issue with doing research. In fact, that reminds me, I'm sorry, I think you may have asked a question earlier. Pull me up if I forget to answer a part, please. Okay. But I think you asked me about success rates earlier, did you? In the program.
Oh, I think I did. Yes, I didn't notice either that we're trying to cover a lot here. It's hard to keep it all straight.
You better put a little note when it gets to that, so that people go, okay, he'll answer it later. Yeah. So I don't publish any success rates, and the reason is quite simply this: it's not scientific. This is a self-help program, and this is not in a clinical setting. And there's some people out there publish like success rates or say this is the amount of people who succeed. This is not science, right? This is not accurate. Mm-hmm. And it is damaging to make assertions because you might either give people false hope or false, what's the opposite of hope? A lack of hope, right? Yeah. And so I think when you look at success rates, it needs to be, and when do you measure it? Like, do you measure it at 5 months, 6 months? Do you measure it at 12 months? Right? So, I mean, I collect data where I'm able to, but that is far from being something scientific that I think you can publish a success rate from. And that's why I don't like to claim numbers because I think it's misleading.
Okay.
And that could be unhelpful for people. But what I will say about it, though, is that we have many people who make full recoveries. We have many people who make partial recoveries, and we have some people who don't make progress, right? But what is more important than that is understanding why that is the case, okay? Right? And that comes back to that earlier thing about the subcategories. Some people are responders, no. We've got to understand why, because once we understand why that is the case, then we can make an adjustment in approach and seek to recover. Yeah.
That's fair. And thank you for remembering to come back to that one. Good memory. You're doing amazing. We're getting close here. We're winding down. Just a couple last questions that came up. Lauren asked, you've talked about this a bit, but maybe just to further clarify, why can't some people get better no matter how hard they try?
Well, one thing is, the first thing that comes to mind is we can try too hard. Mm. That is a key thing. So you know how I talked earlier about many people seem to recover right after they hit that ultimate low, rock bottom, mm-hmm. and that motivation and everything. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, though, because sometimes the motivation is too great. And, certainly for me, it was a case of desperation, think about it, trying to work out what causes an illness that nobody knows when you don't have a medical background. I mean, talk about, if that's not desperate, I don't know what is, right? That seems really unlikely, yeah? So, I think one of the things is sometimes people, you got to understand, we're talking about a maladaptive stress response, right? So when you eat some food the way you digest it, or when you move your body, the stress of movement, or even when you go and have some fun with friends, which you don't think is stressful, that's just having fun. These are all stressors to the nervous system, mm-hmm. and the body reacts and causes these symptoms, right? So it's not something that you necessarily think of negative. It's not a psychological stress, right? And so if you have an issue with any kind of stress and you're trying to recover, and like, oh, I have to do everything, I have to do it right, I didn't do it well enough, this can be a really big problem. I often say to people, it's not what you do in your recovery, it's how you do it. That is key.
So just because someone's putting in 1,000% effort and they're not recovering, it doesn't mean that for them recovery is impossible.
In my coaching, I often ask them to do less.
Okay.
As I often say, you must do less effort.
Okay. And I think this kind of ties into our last question here. Someone else wanted to ask, what I get concerned about is the extreme rules, in just programs in general that may have a point, but they end up causing more stress and allowing for less compassion.
Look at that.
Yeah.
She's hit it right on the head, hasn't she?
Yeah.
All right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So that is the problem, and that's like the thing we're saying about diet. Yeah. I mean, you need to look after your morale and look, the ANS Rewire program, let me be clear, it's very comprehensive. Mm-hmm. It's very comprehensive. But we make it clear that, we roll it out one lesson a day. You can do that. You can watch it. You add one little action step, right? You go through it. It builds, right? And over a period of a couple of months, you've changed so much, you'll be shocked. You go, how did I do that? Right? It's because we take little steps all the time, right? And then you might go through it again, and then you hear all the stuff that you didn't hear or that didn't make sense because you hadn't progressed enough with your recovery. You didn't apply. And then you take it to the next level, right? And it's about building your engagement. And you could say, oh, I have to do all these things. Yeah, but the vast majority of these things just are your lifestyle then in the end. They become part of your lifestyle, right? The way you think, the way you eat, the exercises. I mean, we all do stuff, right? And it's just about changing how we approach all those things. And so you got to make a choice. You got to make a choice. Am I going to stress myself out, or am I going to do this in a way that's easy? And if you decide to do it in a way that's easy, and anything that, don't do overwhelm. Get overwhelmed, go, I'm not doing it. Just do 10% of whatever is there. Just do 10%. And then over time, you'll do 15 and you build it up. Yeah, I think that's a really key thing to recovery. And I wonder, asking you, Raelan, if you've seen that yourself in the recovery interviews. I mean, you've spoken to probably quite a lot of people now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we all notice this, that there definitely seems to be a certain personality type that gets hit with this, and it's those people that want to do 1,000%. So then we attack our recovery with that same 1,000%, and it can get in the way. It definitely was my experience as well. Yeah.
It can be helpful, like being that dedicated and really doing all this stuff. I mean, when I look at the miracle cure people, that's so cool. I love them. Don't get me wrong. They're lovely people, but they're amazing. I mean, I took 18 months to recover. And of course, I didn't have all the tools and strategies and, knowledge the way that I got after I recovered, right? Mm-hmm. Which I'm teaching people. But nonetheless, I mean, most people will take longer than that to recover, right? And you see these people who are like 3 months in and they're like recovered. And why? It's because they did everything. But it's not just that. Is they were able to do everything, and they were able to do everything easily. So it's 3 layers, right? And that's usually based on their background, They've already resolved their PTSD. They've maybe already done certain things like meditation that helped them with some of the brain training mechanisms that we teach them, right? They may already have a diet in place that's not that dissimilar to what we're suggesting. They just make some tweaks, right? They've maybe already, there's other psychological mechanisms, especially around pain perception, that are well researched and very well understood and not taught enough by, pain psychologists. I mean, we know the science. It's well established, right? But it's just not being used enough. But some people have already done some of that work without knowing how they did it, and so when they then go to apply it, it's like they hit the ground running 100%, but that's just not going to be everyone's experience. You just got to do enough to progress.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for this. I've learned so much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all the time and effort you've put into answering all these questions. Of course, we didn't get to all of them, but we got to a lot of them. And I really also appreciate and respect how you didn't shy away from the tougher questions and, let's just tackle them all. So thank you. Thank you so much for this.
You're very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity and thank you for spreading the word of hope.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Right back at you. And thank you to everyone who put all these great questions out. People really put a lot of effort into sending questions over, and I really appreciate it. It helped us, tackle the topics that really matter to people. So thank you to everyone watching for everything that you sent over. And as always, look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments and, any questions that you have. Just keep the conversation going. And of course, all of Dan's information will be in the video's description. So for his websites and how you can get in touch with him and where you can follow him and where you can learn more and how you can contact him. Because I imagine people will definitely want to be doing that. So,
okay.
Yeah, that's
lovely,
it for today.
Lovely to speak with you, Raelan.
Yeah, you
Cheers.
too, Dan. All right. Take care.
Take care.